As folks are getting settled in, can you please share in chat? Let's see if the chat works. Uh, do share where you're joining us from. Always curious. Hit chat. Oh, interesting. Hi, Valerie. Chat is disabled. Let me just enable it right now. We're having some strange technical issues. Just bear with me for a second. I will be right back and figure this out. I'm sure there's an easy fix here. If all else fails, you use the Q&A function, which will be a first, but I'm sure there's an easy way to enable the chat and just try to figure this out. Give me 1 second. Yes, there we go. Hello, Mar.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
We can. It's
Great.
so good to see you. I've been such a big fan of yours for so many years. This is so nice to finally get to meet you virtually.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. All right, we're just getting started. We've run into some technical issue. Our event producer has a crisis, so he wasn't able to join us today. So it's myself and Gabby,
Oh,
and we will be your host for today's event. Before we get started and be introduced our guest speaker, let me just start off with a few housekeeping items. We're asking folks to just share where they're joining us from because I'm always curious who all are joining us and where their interest is from, and always blows me away that we have such a broad diversity of people joining us from Ireland as well. Ireland, Texas, hello, New Jersey. Hi, lots of locals. Welcome, welcome. All right, so just to get started, wanted to let you know who I am and introduce today's guest. I'm Mia Chaudan. I am the founder of Women in AI Ethics. Curious how many people have actually attended one of our events previously. So yes or no, have you attended one of our events previously? A webinar, in-person events? Yes. Yes, okay. You can do the thumbs up. You can say yes. Oh, yeah, Chavi. Awesome. All right. NYC, first time. Okay, you're in for a treat. We started Women in AI Ethics back in 2018 with the first list that was published, which is the 100 Brilliant Women in AI Ethics list. We operate and we work at the intersection of AI, gender, and ethics. We believe that exclusion of women and erasure of women and non-binary people in technology itself is a huge ethical issue. So our work is focused on elevating voices, lesser known voices, well-known voices in this space, which includes our guest speaker today. I'll just address a few quick questions that people generally ask. One is, will this talk be recorded? Yes, it will be recorded. And within 3 to 5 days, we put it up on our YouTube channel. Gabby is in the chat and she will continue to share links for you. And if you have any questions, just drop them in there. Also, you can join the book chat on Slack. Also, the link will be provided. We're just getting started, but it will be a space where you can continue the conversation. You can also sign up for our mailing list. All our events are free. There are very few events which are paid. We are donation funded and volunteer led organizations. So any and all support is welcome, but the mailing list is the best way to keep in touch with us. And Slack, of course. We will have Q&A at the end. It all depends on whether we do generally have these seminars for an hour, and if the speaker is available, we extend it by another half an hour. Today's call will be again recorded. So again, welcome everybody. Happy leap day and happy Lunar New Year for those of you who celebrate. Today is the eve of Women's History Month. We're excited because we know so many women have contributed, made brilliant contributions to this space. So today we have invited data science professor, author, a leading historian, Mar Harks, to discuss their book, Programmed Inequality: How Britain Discarded Women Technologists and Lost its Edge in Computing. This was described by Margot Shetterly, the author of Hidden Figures, as an important lesson for scholars and policymakers seeking ways to improve inclusion in STEM fields. So welcome, Mar.
Thanks so much for having me. And yeah, happy Women's History Month and happy tail end of Black History Month too.
Indeed, indeed. So those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. The tech industry is filled with rich men who take pride in not reading books. So I'm glad you wrote this book. Thank you for writing it. And thank you everyone who's joining us. And thank you for reading these books. There is a second book. So the first book today we'll be talking about is this one, which is the main book that we will talk about today. However, there is another one that you have written. This is a compilations of essays, which may not get to today, but however, okay, let me see if I can show this with you. It's on the screen. So these two books are both highly recommended. We may not get to the second one, but we can provide a link so you can pick it up and read at your own leisure. So let's jump in. So Mar, what I appreciate about your book is that you've clearly connected the dots between the gender problem, which is a feminist problem, which is a labor problem, which is an economics problem, and it is a national competitiveness problem. Your book should be required reading for any serious discussion on technology. And I would love to start off with your background, which is fascinating, what led to this book. You worked as a Unix systems administrator. You didn't have formal computer science training. What was unique about your work environment? Or what were the conversations you were having that encouraged you, inspired you to write this book?
I'm so glad you asked about that. Yeah, the germ of the idea for this book began a long time ago because it grew out of my dissertation. And before I went to grad school, as you said, I worked as a Unix systems administrator. And that was a kind of a unique environment. It was an academic computing environment. And one of the reasons I was hired there is because there was a boss who was a woman and who thought that basically anybody who was, relatively intelligent, had a college degree, could be trained to be a good systems administrator. And I think she was right. She would hire a lot of folks and give them time on the job to learn and to be trained. And so it led to a lot more people in that space who were maybe folks who wouldn't have otherwise done that job. And one of the things that really struck me about that environment was that people skills and communication was incredibly important to doing that job. And also, if you were doing your job right as somebody who was maintaining infrastructure, nobody knew you existed. It was only when things started going wrong that you started becoming visible as a person, because then they tried to find you, right, and say, what is happening to the system that I need to do my research? And the other interesting thing about that workplace was that, like I said, there was not one actually, but two women bosses. And at the time I started, I think I was the only person working there who wasn't a guy. And then there were one or two more women a little bit later on. And it struck all of us, all of the younger folks at that time, that there was this strange gendered inversion where the big bosses were women. And then at the lower levels, there weren't as many women maybe as you might expect if things tend to get more progressive over time. And so we would have these conversations and our bosses would say, well, there used to be a lot more women in computing. It's not like a linear progress narrative in this sense. And that really intrigued me. It was something that I sort of knew already. My mother had been a computer programmer, and I had just kind of taken that for granted, that that was a job women did. But that really made me think a little bit more about, well, what happened to all of these women, both in the US and maybe elsewhere. And as you know, in my book, I decided actually to focus on the UK because it's a pretty interesting case study that I think has some interesting lessons. I can't hear you.
I'm so glad you did that. It because the question that keeps coming up constantly is, why aren't there more women? Why aren't they in this space? How can we get more women? And you pretty much definitively answered that question using UK as a case study. Speaking of the domination of men versus women, right now men dominating the tech industry has been normalized. But there was a time, it was in the 60s, you mentioned in your book, that IBM measured production time and girl hours because the workforce at that time was so feminized. But then women were forced to leave the workforce, right? This wasn't something that just happened by accident. You've laid out how systemically and systematically they were continued to either be forced out and or just excluded. One of those ways was the marriage bar. Can you talk a little bit more about the marriage bar and civil services, and also what were the other ways that women have been systematically excluded from the tech workforce?
Yeah, sure. It's interesting because early on, as you say, computing on both sides of the Atlantic was a fairly feminized field because the work was honestly not seen in many respects as important. Things like, hardware design were not necessarily feminized, but everything from production to programming was. And then there were these structures in place, not necessarily at that point in time to chase women out of computing, but to ensure that women were not in the workforce for very long. In the UK, as you pointed out, in the civil service, there was a formal marriage bar until after World War II, which meant that once women got married, they were expected to resign from their jobs. Now, during World War II, this became a big problem, and they had to loosen it so that they had enough workers to actually do jobs on the home front. And that sort of led to it being removed in a formal sense after the war. However, for decades afterwards in the UK and also in the US, there was still a clear expectation in many, many cases that women would resign from their jobs after they got married or in the lead up to, when they got engaged. And that was because the idea was that married women did not, quote unquote, need to work, at least in certain classes and certain racial subgroups of women were expected to, go home, have children, and not need to work. And if they did come back into the workforce, which they often did, that meant that they would do work that was not on a career trajectory, that was sort of, not necessarily, I don't want to use the term lower level, but work that was boxed out of essentially advancement. And so there are a lot of ways that traditional gender roles have, made it so that women have been cut out of career paths, because career paths require, of course, staying in the workforce, and usually staying in the workforce in a sort of unbroken, time unbroken way. And that's something that we're still, I think, figuring out today, how to accommodate different life patterns and different styles that people need in order to succeed in the workforce. And it does break down along highly gendered lines still.
It was a little disturbing to see how that played out along gender lines. The same excuse given for them not to stay in the workforce was also used against women as not qualified for promotion, because if you haven't been in the workforce, or if you're going to get married, that was held against them. And we are talking about the 60s. One of the rationalizations that was used to include more women, like all good intentions, right? The intention was to get more women, and the rationalization was employing female clerks. Not only were they more efficient, they were smart and so on, but they also were positioned as cheap labor, interchangeable labor, especially when it comes to computing, because they were doing a lot of the machine work. Can you talk about how the business cases based on women being more productive, or women being more efficient, or more cheaper labor played into just women being stuck in these roles which were not considered they were not considered experts, and the fact that then they were always positioned stereotyped into the non-expert role?
Yeah, in the UK in particular, they were, and by they I mean managers and management magazines where managers would write to each other and talk about these things. They were very, very open about the fact that the lack of national equal pay legislation meant that women were a better bet in a lot of cases for a lot of jobs. They were economically advantageous to hire because you did not have to pay them as much. And they would say, oh, and they can do these jobs just as well or better in certain cases, and that these jobs are really good for women because we don't actually want to have the people doing these jobs stay around a long time and potentially get to these higher levels where they command a higher salary. And these women will essentially age out of the workforce due to marriage and having children, was the idea at the time. And so they're even more economically advantageous to hire because there's this built-in turnover mechanism for them. And this was, something that essentially was a smart business decision at this point in time to use these mechanisms of the labor market, which we might find rather discriminatory, exploitative, in order to save money, both in the government and in industry. And this, had a powerful effect on what the cost and value of that labor force overall was in reality. So if people are only valued at a certain point and paid a certain amount, that very quickly becomes the accepted cost of their labor. And one of the problems that I'm sure probably infuriated you as you were reading my book was that during the push to get equal pay in the civil service, which was supposed to be a meritocracy, so equal pay came into the civil service earlier than nationally. Nationally, it happened in the 70s, or was supposed to happen in the 70s, and it happened in the civil service in the 1950s. However, the majority of women in the civil service did not get equal pay as a result of equal pay being introduced in the civil service. Let me say that one more time. Equal pay did not mean equal pay for the majority of women in the civil service. And that was because so many women were in what were called machine grades, so working with machines, or feminized grades, women only grades, that the people at the top instituting equal pay said, those women have been in these roles in such great numbers and for so long that the pay scales for women in those roles, that's now the market rate for the job. We're not going to raise them to the men's pay scales in those jobs because we hardly ever use them. So the market rate is now the lower women's pay scale, and that's what it will stay even after equal pay. And that's one big way that, feminized machine work helped thwart women getting equal pay when they were supposed to get equal pay in the civil service, which really, honestly, as a researcher, blew my mind when I saw that happening in the archives and the women's grades suddenly becoming renamed as the quote excluded grades because they were excluded from the provisions of the Equal Pay Act. But that's just one really, I think, crisp example of how people's worth and their value economically is really, really tied to what they're paid and what they're able to advocate for themselves to be paid in the workforce.
What was most infuriating, so many things in this book, is the it was intentional, it was deliberate, it was a decision made by the people in power to say women will be kept in a certain role at a certain pay scale. And there seems to be this fear of backlash from men. Also, when you talk about the marriage bar, to removal of that, they fear there will be a violent backlash by men because the number of opportunities to men would diminish. And also they made the case for why women belong in the special category of classes, but then so that they wouldn't have to match those with the men's pay scales, but it was very intentional and deliberate setting up of the scales for the classes where they were majority women, right? When they're men, the pay scale magically, somehow, intentionally, were just bumped up. So it was just fascinating and disturbing to see how intentional it was by the state. These were not just random choices or decisions. This was pretty much deliberate. Your research showed that class distinctions show up in the tech workforce. And this is something that not a lot of technology, even gender books, Western feminist books talk about, unless you're talking from a labor perspective. But just the fact that you can overcome gender issues in the workplace if you belong to a certain social class. And that in turn also influences how people view progress. Can you talk about some of that, how individual success sometimes is conflated with collective progress? Like, say, this person made it as into manager class. So of course there is progress, there's equality, there's equity. Can you talk a little bit more about that perception?
Yeah, there are multiple categories, as you point out, that are really salient when we're talking about issues of equality, particularly in the workforce. Gender is a big one. Race, of course, overlaps a lot. Class is a huge one. Things like ability and disability, also really important. And this sort of, I don't know, first past the finish line ethos that we see sometimes, that is sort of born out of what you might term white feminism. It makes it seem sometimes like there has been more progress than there actually has. And it's also made the progress that we do have more fragile politically, and more conditional, because instead of raising everybody up, what happens is that a few people, usually a few, I'm talking about the US and UK context here, few white women might get into the C-suite, they might get into higher level roles, and then they're held up as these great examples, and it's sort of said, oh, well, look, we have them. If they can do it, clearly it's not unfair. If they can do it, anybody can do it. And of course, you can't take the exceptions that prove the rule, that there's a lot of discrimination, and say that that in fact proves the opposite. That does not make any sense, but we see that happen again and again. And when you have, just these one or two people from a given group making it to the top, say they're lucky enough to make it to the very top, make it to the C-suite, which is still quite unusual. What happens is that those people usually are either outnumbered in ways that they can't really be critics of the system that they're a part of, or they won't continue to succeed in it, or they potentially have never really been critics of the system. And so that's why they've been able to rise so far. Now, this is not true in all cases. There are some people who are very vocal critics and who do get to fairly high levels. But it's much harder to kind of make change from the inside, I think, historically, as an individual, than we're often sold. A lot of young people, I think, are sold this idea that you can go into an industry that's, let's just say, broken in serious ways, and you can fix it from the inside as an individual. That really is not true. That rarely happens. You need to have some level of support, group solidarity, class solidarity, and then build on that. And that's how things change. It's not a singular individual usually who can change much, even though those are the stories that people like to read, and those are the stories that people like to write, even when writing it is maybe a little bit of hagiography, a little bit of myth making, more than an actual description of what happened. Or sometimes, like I said, maybe it is what happened, but that particular woman might be, the exception that proves the rule, might be the person who shows exactly what's going on that is still keeping so many women out of the workforce. And, there are a few examples that we can talk about there if we want to.
Absolutely. Thank you for the real talk. And I'm always concerned when I hear this the mythology of the tech savior, someone who goes into organizations and creates change. And like you said, that's being sold to young people without clearly outlining just there are repercussions and there will be backlash against when you try and when you're trying to change the status quo, when you go up against systemic issues. And we're seeing it for so many whistleblowers, so many women in the tech industry who have been fired for speaking up. Dr. Timnit Gebru is such a shining example and a great person who mentioned today, like you said, the end of like closing of Black History Month. And she's one woman who consistently has shown up and spoken up. And we can see that as a case study of when the consequences of sometimes speaking up. The exception is that you succeed and you're taken your word with, you can drive change within the organization.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Yeah, because so many disproportionately, we see these, what you might call whistleblowers or really strong critics of tech who encounter pretty severe consequences because they really are speaking truth to power. They're disproportionately women and also Black women and women of color. And in fact, there's also a very disproportionate number of trans women in those groups as well. And I don't think that's a coincidence.
Absolutely. And I like what you mentioned because it's so spot on about this expectation that you will not rock the boat because, like you said, they may not have the women who are selected for some of these leadership roles. There's this unsaid rule of expectation of complicity that we will let you in, we will open the door and bring you into this position with the expectations you are not going to shake things up too much or you're not going to change things around because the system was not built for that. So it's a lot of to expect from singular solitary soul women and, like you said, trans women, women of color to be driving that change, being from those groups. So just a quick note to everybody who's just joining us, welcome on this leap day and eve of Women's History Month. We have a leading historian, author and scholar and data science professor, Mar Hicks, has joined us today, and we are discussing their incredibly brilliant book, Programmed Inequality. And we were talking about how Professor Hicks has laid out very clearly the connection points between the exclusion of women and the impact it can have on national competitiveness. So that's what we are talking about. So if you're just joining us, welcome. So going into representation, so I like to call out that not all representation is equal, and your book called that out as well. One is representation in labor unions, and then there's representation in leadership roles. The civil service marriage bar, which is the bar that forces women that forced women to resign, leave the workforce when they got married, was overturned in 1946 because the main clerical union was by that time predominantly women. So they were vocal and they were effective in overturning that. However, you mentioned the Equal Pay Act. Now, Equal Pay Act was passed in the 70s, then the National Sex Discrimination Act in 75. Only the reason the National Sex Discrimination Act was passed because UK wanted to join the EEC, the European Economic Commission, and the requirement for joining, because they were rejected a few times, right? And then they were able to get in by passing this act. However, in 83, then they were censured because they did not meet those their own standards. Now, this is during Margaret Thatcher's tenure. Now, Margaret Thatcher, for those of you who don't know, was the first woman to lead a leading political party in the UK. She was the first female prime minister. She was also the first prime minister with a science degree. Now, all of this is happening during her time. So can you talk to us about how representation in the labor unions versus representation of women in leadership roles is so different and the impact it can have on driving more inclusion in the tech industry?
Yeah, it's such a great paradox that you point out, right? That so many of the things that we would associate with, conservatives in the UK that are frankly injurious to a lot of women and to public services that a lot of women rely on when, for instance, they are essentially squeezed out of the paid workforce. Those are things that, Margaret Thatcher was not at all a fan of, that she thought the state should not be paying for, or rather that taxpayers, through paying their taxes should not be paying for that. And it's a great example, Margaret Thatcher's tenure as prime minister, which at the time was seen as very successful. It's only in retrospect, I think, that it's flipped to being seen in a much more critical light. It was a great example of a woman not just governing, but in fact, getting to the point of being able to have that power by being, in some ways, an arch conservative, by saying a lot of things that were against what you would expect were her interests in terms of certainly her gender, and even to an extent that would potentially go against her class interests. But she was, adamant that the way forward for the UK was by jumping on the bandwagon of privatization, by trying to get the free market involved in a lot of things that we sort of knew at the time and definitely know now it really should not be involved in, or it's not successful usually when it's involved in these types of endeavors and industries. And her administration, was a start to really hollowing out the welfare state, the NHS took a hit, and all of the sorts of things that had been put into place in the post-war era to try to make it easier for people, and especially working people, and also for women to live in the UK. That all started to be hollowed out under her reign. I'm sorry, I forget if there was a second part to your question there. Did I cover what you were hoping I would?
Yes, you did. Thank you. I was trying to get to just the differences between having representation in labor unions, which in the tech industry is still not very common. It did start with folks like, again, Meredith Whittaker and others who've done labor organizing in tech, versus women, we look at women in leadership positions to pull everybody up. And I wanted to, you pretty much answered my question, but just a contrast between what your representation in labor union means as a worker versus what representation at the leadership level means, because these are very different paradigms.
Yeah, they really are. It really matters what body you're leading and what the priorities are of that body. Yeah.
So in 1919, now this struck me as really interesting in your book. It was the Communist Party of Britain who released this pamphlet advocating for equal pay. And this was back in 1919. But then the national equal pay, like we talked about, it was not passed until the 1970s. But when workers tried to organize using that Equal Pay Act, there was a lot of pushback from tech companies, especially at the IBM UK, where the management fought all these unionization efforts. And I feel in the narrative, the tech narrative, and even when it comes to gender rights, there's not a lot of clarity, I feel, that or knowledge out there about how both are related. The labor rights and civil rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights and civil rights. And so can you talk about how the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and their impact on women's rights and their ability to be included, and also when it comes to equal pay, how they play a huge role in ensuring that women did get equitable pay?
Yeah, it's a little bit of the more things change, the more they stay the same situation, right? We see IBM UK all those decades ago fighting unionization, tooth and nail, trying to convince workers, particularly, computer workers, that they were white collar and they were somehow more aligned with management, so they didn't need unions. And that's a tactic that has been used very effectively down through the decades, continues to be used to try to convince many many white-collar workers, particularly in tech, that they don't really need a union. And right now we have, in the United States at least, massive layoffs happening in the tech industry for honestly not a whole lot of good reasons. There are reasons, but they're not necessarily great reasons for layoffs. They're not tightly tied to, needing to make financial cuts or anything like that. And I think it's really underscored the importance for a lot of people of having solidarity with other workers and labor power needing to be organized. And one of the things that, was going on in 60s, the 70s, on down through the 80s is that a lot of the labor unions, and, this is both within tech industry in the UK and also in other industries, they were really, and they continue to be, a really important vehicle, not perfect, but very important for helping women and other marginalized groups as workers assert their worth and rights and build power in a collective in a way that they can then go up against really, really powerful people, really, really powerful organizations. They can go up against management. They can go up against powerful companies, or in the case of the government, they can go up against government employers, and they can say that they are demanding better pay, they're demanding better working conditions, and so on. And as you pointed out, I think a bit earlier, this National Equal Pay Act was incredibly fraught in the UK because one of the primary reasons it came into being, aside from all of the activism of women and women's allies, was because at that point, both the Tories and the Labour Party really, really thought it was critical to the UK's future to be part of the common market, to be part of the EEC, which was the forerunner to the EU, which the UK Britain famously left a while ago. And that hasn't been going so well for it. Well, for all of the reasons that we see it now being kind of a disaster, those were the reasons that they wanted in then. And in order to do so, the EEC said, you're going to need to make your economy more robust in certain ways. And one of the things is you need equal pay and an equal pay act and mechanism for enforcing it, because only economies that really are kind of mired in the past and not going to have a lot of growth potential do the sorts of shit you're pulling with gender discrimination. And so the UK basically said, fine, we'll do that. And then behind the scenes said, we're not going to change anything. We're going to put this on the books and we're going to change as little as we possibly can. I mean, that is only a very loose paraphrasing of what is said in the archives about this by very high level people. And so that meant that it was a little bit toothless, this act, and that it was hard to enforce, and that it was hard to even bring a case in a lot of situations, because one of the easiest ways to deprive folks of their rights, and this is both in the workforce and elsewhere, is today to say that they or what they're doing is somehow slightly different and therefore not quite comparable to what, say, white men are doing. And the best or the better equal pay acts around the world say that when people are doing comparable work, even if it's called something different, they should be entitled to equal pay and equal treatment. And what the UK National Sex Discrimination Act and Equal Pay Act said was that essentially the job category had to be pretty much almost exactly the same in order for a claim to be made for equal pay. And so the bar to be met to try to bring a case and say, I'm being paid unfairly, was unfortunately high enough, and intentionally it was this way, to try to preclude people from, in fact, being able to use it to say, I'm being discriminated against, this class of workers is being discriminated against, and the pay needs to change. Because there was a gigantic commitment, a very overt commitment to, in fact, changing without having to actually change, trying to say, look, we're going to still do things the way we've always done them. We're going to do what we need to do to get in. And then, we're not really going to change much under the hood. And they were caught for that. And as you point out, censured by the EU for failing in that respect.
We keep saying, we keep seeing over and over the same playbook being used, and the same, like you said, it's like so much just stays the same. And people believe, there's this belief, the common belief that legislations and laws are the magic bullets. And everybody cheers, right? Oh, this law was passed, or that legislation was passed for gender equality or equity or what have you, more women on the board and so forth. And to your point, it's like they're only as effective as just the willingness to enforce those, and not just letter of the law, but in the spirit in which they were written. So much of this just seems like window dressing and something to placate the vocal critics that, hey, we did pass something. And like you said, there are ways that you can weasel out of some of those requirements. But interesting that they were caught and then censured by the EEC for that. Now, over the years, even US and the UK have passed many of these legislation. In the US, there have been many legislations that have passed. Can you talk a little bit about looking through some of these? Which one have been effective, like could be a model to follow, versus like we won't talk about the ones which haven't been as effective because we know there's so many. Maybe there are some that we should look at and feel optimistic that they actually did do work.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, that it's not about legislation alone. The best legislation is not going to change much if there aren't robust enforcement mechanisms. So whenever, I think we've seen successful legislation, for instance, in the case of the United States, it's been when there has been, gender rights or civil rights legislation put into place. And then at the same time, there is an agency entrusted with enforcing those laws, an agency that its entire remit pretty much is to ensure that that law actually gets put into practice and is sort of the clearinghouse for people who have complaints and lawsuits and so on, and want to use those new laws and sets of laws to try to assert their rights. And we started seeing legislation and the corresponding organizations for enforcing that legislation coming in, not a perfect way at all, but in a somewhat successful way in the 1960s in the United States. And then we saw a flood of legal cases throughout the 70s and the 80s, where women in particular and people of color were trying to use these new agencies and laws to do everything from, assert their rights in the housing market to get equal or to get equal pay. This is actually, where the term intersectionality comes from. It's a term describing a legal case in which Black women at a particular corporation were trying to assert their rights both as women and as Black workers, and say we are being doubly discriminated against, and that when we are looked at as just Black people legislatively or as just women, and sort of the assumption there legally was that women were not also Black. Well, when we're looked at that way, we're sort of split between two categories, and we can't fully advocate for ourselves and fully describe what's happening. And so, Kimberly Crenshaw, famous legal scholar, coined this term intersectionality to discuss what was happening in some of these legal cases where the Black women plaintiffs were trying to cohere as a legal class and say, please understand our complaints as part of a legal class of Black women, and how that level of discrimination is different from what, for instance, white women or Black men are experiencing in the same workforce. And they had a lot of trouble doing that because one of the things that the courts would say is, oh, you're not big enough to be a class. You know, there's too few of you. So it's this horrible catch-22. Well, there's too few of them, right? Because they simply cannot get into, say, these management roles or whatever roles they're trying to get into. Then they try to use the legislation to work to their advantage, and they're told you can't be a legal class because there aren't enough of you. It's this horrible kind of catch-22. It's the same sort of catch-22 you see with the myth of meritocracy, where because people are striving towards meritocratic ideals, a lot of people then say, or a lot of people at the top say, or try to convince people, oh, see, we do have a meritocracy. We hold those ideals, so we have a meritocracy. And therefore, if you're not cutting it, it means you just have to work harder. Well, you can knock yourself out all you want, working as hard as you like, but you can't outwork an unfair system past a certain point. You know, something you can't sort of meritocracy your way out of an anti-meritocratic system. And unfortunately, that's a line that's been very much pushed, I think, to a lot of folks over the course of many decades. And that's why we have issues like the what's called the STEM pipeline problem, where a lot of women go into the beginning of the pipeline and then they leak out before they get to the higher level jobs, or even sometimes the middle level jobs. And people say, oh, what's happening there? Because, you know, there's so many people going in the front end of the pipeline, and it's presumably a meritocracy now. Why can't they succeed? Well, it's, you know, only presumably a meritocracy.
Thank you for saying that and writing an entire book outlining that, because these are receipts, but these are actual case studies and actual data points, because we have to get out of this mindset, this narrative that's being popularized by the tech industry, that somehow if you're not succeeding, it is your fault. And I love what you said. You cannot outrun or outperform in an unfair system. And the fact that they constantly point to this one person who made it, or this one woman who made it, as some sort of a sign that, hey, we are making progress, so it's all in your head, is not really in our head. The data shows that it's a system that wasn't designed for women or to succeed. So thank you so much for that. If folks have a lot of questions, I have one last question for you
Yeah, sure.
before
And
we
could I
switch over.
interrupt for
Yeah,
one quick second, just
of
because I
course.
saw somebody pop up Steve Shirley's name in the chat? And
Yeah.
that is a great example. You know, Steve Shirley, wildly successful. One of the reasons that she went off to start her own software startup in the 60s was because she was getting squeezed out of promotions that she deserved in the workforce. And so she decided to go do her own thing. And then she decided to try to make it a workplace that was more conducive to working women. And so it's a great example of how her success was, you know, the exception to the norm, and it was working against all of these mechanisms that we've been talking about. And I think the person in the chat highlighted that as well. I'm so sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to call that out.
Oh, no, no worries at all. We have so many great questions and comments in the chat. Folks, if you have questions, do you mind just popping them into the Q&A? It will just be easier than going through the entire chat and try to pick out your questions. If you wouldn't mind, just copy paste, put them into the Q&A, and we'll get them to in 2 minutes. Mar, again, thank you so much. You've been amazing. This book is amazing. I keep reading and rereading it. I'm infuriated, but also feel so much better informed about not just history, just looking at how that plays out in today's world. So my question for you is, before we move to Q&A, is you've drawn a clear line between exclusion of women, underestimating and undermining their expertise in the tech workforce, to UK losing its competitive edge. And this was this is an outcome of deliberate choices that they made, which they continue to seem to be making even today. So it's not just a historical fact, nice to know. These are continuing on today. So what is your guidance to folks, people in power, making policies, and everyone who is thinking about these issues? Like, what would your guidance be to them? Like, what should they be doing differently, other than, of course, stop using the same playbook of the 60s? Yeah, so what else should they be doing?
It's such a great question. And in some ways, I think you're not going to like my answer because a lot of the folks who are in control, they know what they need to be doing, right? But they're not going to because it's not that important to them and it's not lucrative to them. One of the mistakes that we see again and again is people in power in particular, but also larger, the larger society and the larger discourse, sort of pretending that what hurts the people who are most marginalized in a system is somehow not a real problem, that it's a bug to be patched, that it's not really a structural problem, when in fact, not only is it a huge problem for those marginalized groups, but it's also very usually, it's a warning sign about broader harms that are eventually, sometimes quite quickly, going to result for everyone. I want to give an example since we are still last day of Black History Month. Two people in particular who spring to mind who are really important in calling out some of the early harms of networked online disinformation and misinformation, how that was being weaponized in really powerful ways, were Shafiqua Hudson and Rael Ainasa Kiem. Now, these two Black feminists were behind the hashtag "Your Slip is Showing" on Twitter. They used this hashtag to point out, to expose, and to talk about how bad actors were pretending to be these racist caricatures of Black women to try to manipulate online political discourse and sow political dissent in the US, especially among the US left, in the lead up to the 2016 election. And they were talking about this well before people had these retrospectives where they noticed that, Gamergate was a sort of a harbinger of the alt-right threat and what happened in 2016. They were far, far ahead of the curve. And there's a great Salon article called "The Black Feminists Who Saw the Alt-Right Threat Coming," if you want to read about this a bit more. And at the same time, many, many other Black scholars and activists and technologists, I can't name them all, but I'll just name a few, like Meredith Clark, Sidat Harry, Shireen Mitchell, Sophia Noble, Andre Brock. Like I said, there are many, many more. They were also warning about online mis and disinformation for years before most white people in tech or the media took it at all seriously as the huge problem for democracies globally that it was. And by the time that, the broader public finally started to accept this message, in the US at least, it was really kind of too late to head off some of the really significant national and global harm that had already been done, from electoral and political harm to public health disinformation. The pandemic essentially killed Shafiqua Hudson. It's horrifying, right? This is what she was trying to work against and alert people to through her entire adult life. And it's so important, I think, that, we can say that we need to listen to those who understand patterns of historical harm and to center them, but they're not going to be listened to by those at the top, and what they say is not going to be implemented unless usually there's a forcing factor. Now, sometimes, in many cases, that forcing factor is that an obvious disaster has occurred. That's why Twitter started listening to, for instance, the people that I was just talking about, and they didn't pay them, they didn't thank them or anything like that once they did start implementing their insights to try to beef up their moderation. But the other thing that is so key, aside from exposing these harms, is, and all of these activists that I mentioned, they were doing this as well, is to build power from the bottom up, whether that's in the context of labor unions, grassroots political, organization at the community level, at the state level. All of that needs to be happening simultaneously. And some of the most important gains, I would say, when it comes to pushing back against surveillance technology, particularly surveillance technology that either is in use or could be in use by police forces to be really, really, clearly abrogate people's civil rights. A lot of that has happened at the state and local level. And a lot of the people behind that have been Black women pushing these movements forward, getting these communities together to push back against, for instance, technologies like ShotSpotter in Chicago is, finally starting to, I think, encounter enough pushback that it's hopefully not going to continue to expand. And other types of surveillance technologies are getting finally talked about in the ways that I think and many other people think they should have been talked about from the start, which is it's not about how do we make this system work, it's about why do we want to accept certain systems that are going to do, they're telling us what they're going to do up front. Why do we want that? Why do we want a system where the very affordances of that infrastructure is to make it so that people are more surveilled and less likely to have privacy, less likely to have their civil rights? So I just wanted to mention that because, these are all linked issues. Technology is fundamentally a force multiplier. It's about power most of the time. And it's not a coincidence that the first computers were weapons of war, as I talk about in my book, Informational Warfare. And what do we see going on right now? We have an AI boom where the very powerful are making money hand over fist to try to use an unproven technology to replace workers, or if they can't replace workers, at least drive down wages, while at the same time, in the US at least, government and industry are refusing to invest in what's needed to keep the human labor force from, say, repeatedly getting sick and getting serious illnesses that are going to cause a high number of people to become too disabled to work, or, that continue to, in fact, kill thousands of people every month in the US alone. So it's a very, very political thing, which technologies get funded, get implemented. And if people aren't already, I just really want to encourage everybody to look at which technologies are invested in and deployed, why we have more AI and not all the clean air technologies that maybe we should have for safer public schools, safer workplaces. Why is it that the technologies that concentrate power and make the rich richer, even when they don't work very well at all, are the ones that we are repeatedly told, this is what we need more of, this is what we need to invest in, and this is the way to the future. I don't think a lot of that, in fact, is the way to the future, at least not the future that a lot of us really want, right? So anyway, that's just my pitch for, if you're not a fan of history, why history matters very much in this present moment.
Thank you so much. This was just so incredibly powerful. Just drawing the lessons from history to make sure that we are not repeating the same patterns and the same repeat of the same, right? Avoiding that. So first of all, we will be wrapping up the recording in a minute. I wanted to first of all thank you so much for joining us, for inspiring us, your hard work that went into just mapping out the history of computing to today, just leading so many of these efforts to making sure that we are better informed. So thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. I, really, really appreciate it.